What does radical faith look like? Ordinary faith may be something that is human, but I would say radical faith is something that can only come from the hand of God when you're following God. So let's look at an example of the requirements of radical faith in Joshua chapter 3. This is Eric Slawick, the UWM Pen Guy, and this is the Bible commentary. As always, if you liked what you're seeing, I would ask that you hit like and subscribe in order to help the channel grow. And now, without further ado, let's get into the Word. So today we're going to look at Joshua chapter 3, verse 8. It'll probably be a brief study because I wanted to emphasize a theme that I'm shamelessly borrowing from a sermon that I heard. And let's read the verse. And as for you, command the priests who bear the ark of the covenant, when you come to the brink of the waters of the Jordan, you shall stand still in the Jordan. Now, this deals with the question of radical faith because, or by way of contrast, with the requirements placed upon the people in the previous miracle of the Red Sea. This comparison and contrast is something we're seeing repeatedly in Joshua chapters 3 and 4 because both of them are essentially inaugural miracles, inaugurating a new era in Israel's history. I'd alluded in a previous video to the way in which there was a pivot point, and there are many pivot points throughout the history of the Bible between one epoch or era and another of God's work. Now, the radicalness of the requirement here was seen by contrast, and we can look at a brief summary quote here for what Moses had commanded their parents at the parting of the Red Sea, where the Red Sea was simply split in two and the people walked through on dry land. Now, ironically enough, even this, I guess you could say, less radical faith that was demonstrated by the people at the time of the Exodus is noted in Hebrews chapter 11, where it says, by faith, the people walked through the Red Sea as on dry land, which, in a brief tangent, naturally begs the question as to what was this faith that God is speaking of? Because these were the rebels that had been doomed to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And I think what you have here is the difference between individual and collective faith. They had faith in the moment that they acted in crossing the Red Sea, and then they lost that faith because collective groups of people can't be saved. Only individuals can be saved. And so the collective actions, even of a group of those who ultimately turned out to be rebels, can be held up as a model of faith. And certainly there was an element which kind of works both ways at the Red Sea. And you can see this in the way the people panicked, which I'll put up here again, because I think it's worth bringing back to mind specific details of the Exodus account, that the people saw the armies of Israel crashing down upon them, and they panicked. They thought they were doomed, and they cried out to the Lord. And Moses acted on behalf of God, and it was a very, very imperfect faith, as would be demonstrated a mere 2 chapters later. But in the moment, it was a genuine faith in their collective action. Now, having the armies of Pharaoh pressing down on them from one perspective could make what they did more remarkable because, well, their lives were being threatened, and they were therefore going to be risking their lives one way or another. But by the same token, they were going to be risking their lives one way or another. In a sense, they had no choice. What were they going to do? Turn around, 2 million of them, turn around unarmed and face the mightiest army on earth at that time? So in one sense, it's more remarkable because of the sheer scale of the circumstances, and in one sense, it's less. And I think there's actually a direct parallel here today to the question of legalistic obedience. Now, what I mean by this is one can ask the question of certain religious traditions where you believe that you have to perform in order to be saved. Is that it's a perpetual controversy you can mull over in your spirit, whether a person who follows God under a terrible bondage of obligation out of fear that not following God will result in you going to hell. Is that noble or is that tragic? And I don't think there's a single answer, varying from person to person, because Paul does seem to suggest that the people of Israel had nobility to their false faith, even the Pharisaical version of it, because he said they had a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. He seems to suggest that that's a good thing, but it's either he's suggesting it's a good thing, but it's a good thing perverted by the lack of knowledge, or he's suggesting it's a bad thing because of the lack of knowledge. I tend to lean towards the former possibility, though I'm open to the latter. And in the case of these Pharisees, Jesus says so many negative things about them. I think the weight of evidence would point towards the idea that, in principle, in and of itself, a legalistic obedience is actually a net negative. The tricky part comes in that so many people, even in the most legalistic of religions, may not be acting out of sheer burden of bondage of legalistic obedience and may genuinely seek to please God, and then that desire is perverted by the false gospel that they are adhering to. Now, to bring this back around to the miracle at hand, we see how, by contrast, this is a truly remarkable faith, because these priests actually have to go into the waters of the Jordan, which a later verse will emphasize overflows its banks at harvest time, which I think means don't quote me on this, but I believe that means there's reason to suggest that the Jordan was unusually thick at this time. And so it wasn't, humanly speaking, all that safe necessarily for these priests to just go out into the middle of a rushing river bearing the presence of God on these poles. It seems kind of ludicrous, but we'll see that very quickly their faith is vindicated. And they had to just stand there and wait for the miracle of God. The order was essentially reversed, where with their fathers, the miracle had happened and then the people walked. Here, the people walked and then the miracle happened. So, in conclusion, what does radical faith look like? Radical faith looks like a willingness to follow God even when the circumstances may seem contrary to the promises of that faith. Or, in other words, radical faith steps out expecting the results rather than having the results and then stepping out. However, if you haven't exercised faith in Christ at all, then this is all kind of a moot point for you. So if you haven't, then I would encourage you to seek the God who will answer your faith with the parting of the seas, so to speak, to guide you into the promised land, which is the blessing on earth and eternal salvation in heaven. That's not to say that the promised land is always a picture of this, but I think it's a decent allegory in this case. And so until next time, this is Eric Slawick, the UWM Penn guy, and this has been the Bible Commentary.